much logic to that. It's an irrational request. It's an irrational demand to make on someone else, right? So no, it's not going to happen. And then obviously what ends up happening is that the individual typically resorts to suicide rather than euthanasia. But typically when you see voluntary acts of euthanasia, it's because the person is in an infirmed condition, or the person is just, you know, lived their life to the fullest, to the extent they're older now, and they're troubled with pain and suffering, and they typically ask a spouse or a family member to assist in the process of euthanasia. Okay, so that's voluntary euthanasia. The next is what's known as non-voluntary euthanasia. The next is non-voluntary euthanasia, and this is where the patient's life is ended without, and this is the important part, without his or her consent. Consent/knowledge. Non-voluntary euthanasia is where the patient's life is ended without his or her consent or knowledge. Right? A decision has been made behind closed doors about a patient's life. Now, if you think about the Terry Schiavo case years back, and I'm currently in the state of Florida, I'm in Fort Lauderdale. Terry Schiavo case was a huge case for many, many reasons, right? And I'm not going to get into all the political sort of problems that arose because of the Terry Schiavo case. But one of the main problems was, in the Terry Schiavo case, this of non-voluntary euthanasia, right? If the patient doesn't know, right, and there was nothing really there to say that she, the argument was her husband was, if I remember correctly, her husband was a nurse, and she had told him verbally that she had a DNR on file, a do not resuscitate. I should probably write that down. DNR means do not resuscitate, right? So she had a DNR on file, but she had never actually written one out, and no hospital had one on file. He goes to the hospital and he says, hey, she had a DNR on file. She should be allowed to die, right? She should passive euthanasia. She should be allowed to die. That was her request. The medical community doesn't have anything on file. They don't want to be held liable for killing this woman when they don't have any information saying she doesn't have a DNR on file, and so on and so on and so on. The point of non-voluntary euthanasia, it's not as scary as it sounds, right? It's not like someone, I mean, though it can encompass this, it's not like someone is just going to be euthanized despite their knowledge. Usually, non-voluntary euthanasia arises in severe cases of trauma, a coma, and a decision has been made by family members or those responsible guardians of this individual, and the person doesn't know that they're going to be euthanized, right? The person's in a state of a coma, typically. 99% of the time in non-voluntary euthanasia, the person's in a coma. And a decision has been made by loved ones, family members, spouses, that the individual is going to be euthanized, though no one in the medical community talks about euthanization, right? You never say it. So if this person's on a respirator, the argument might be, okay, we'll pull the respirator, right? In the act of pulling the respirator out and allowing the individual to passively die, if the individual doesn't know that he or she is about to die, that's an example of non-voluntary euthanasia. The biggest problem, obviously, with non-voluntary euthanasia is that the act of euthanizing the individual results without knowledge, right? So that knowledge is foregone, right? Knowledge is not considered. The individual, and technically it can't be considered, right? The knowledge of the patient doesn't have access to protest, right? The patient doesn't have the ability or the means to say that he or she is against this act. So we cannot incorporate the sum of that, the general sum of that, is that the patient's voice cannot be incorporated into the actual act, right? You are never going to hear the voice of the patient. Okay, so I'll just put no voice for patient. Alright, and then the last form of euthanasia is involuntary. E-O-L-U-N-T-A-R-Y. Involuntary euthanasia. And this is where the patient's life is ended despite objection. This is where involuntary euthanasia is where the patient's life is ended despite an objection, right? The patient, it's different from non-voluntary, because in non-voluntary the patient doesn't know that he or she is going to be euthanized. In involuntary euthanasia, the patient knows that someone is attempting to euthanize them, and the patient protests against being euthanized, but the patient is nonetheless euthanized, right? So you can see sort of the gradation in forms of euthanasia. The obvious problem, and the biggest problem with involuntary euthanasia, is that it's a violation of the patient's consent, right? You're going to be euthanized, so euthanization despite objection, right? There's no interest in consent, right? So that consent is never asked for, and what ends up happening is the patient is euthanized despite an objection, right? So that euthanization despite objection becomes a problem. So this is a huge violation of, it's the greatest violation of a human's right, is their right to live, and patient is killed despite protest. Right? The patient is killed despite the protest. P-D-E-S-P-I-T. Right? The patient is killed despite the protest. That's a huge drawback, right? So then, now it's a matter of sort of seeing how these combine, right? What is the relationship between these, because they obviously combine in very interesting forms. The first thing to see is that with respect to active euthanasia, right? With respect to active euthanasia, we know that there are advantages to active euthanasia, and I gave you an example earlier. It allows the patient to die much faster. It avoids prolonging an exaggerated death, but there is a disadvantage, right? And the disadvantage is that it forces members of the medical community to act in this manner. But there's also things that can happen. The question then becomes, what is, and now I'll erase this, the question then becomes, what is the worst form, if I were to say combine two of these, any two of these numbers, combine two of these numbers and tell me what you think would be the worst form of euthanasia that one could participate in. Now, theoretically, think about what would be the worst combination of two numbers. Like, let's say I was to say 2 and 3. Would that be the worst form, or whatever? Well, if you think about it, it would definitely be 5, right? So we know it's going to be 5 because the patient doesn't want to die, right? The patient doesn't feel that he or she needs to die, right? So we know that's going to be 5, right? So 5 and what? Well, if we look at the other ones, this is patient requested, right? And so that can't go. It can't be 5 and 3, right? It can't be 5 and 2 because the patient doesn't have knowledge, and 4, the patient does have knowledge, so it only leaves us with passive and active, right? So if it were passive, the patient is allowed to die. What that tells me is that the patient is dependent on some type of life support. The patient knows that he or she is dependent on some life support, and the patient is allowed to die in that sense, right? So that's pretty horrific, right? You're gonna be allowed to pass away knowing while you're dying that this is happening, right? The argument, however, and I think actually that's pretty bad, right?